sold for silver to a ruthless rancher. The tragic story of Sarah McAllister. The autumn wind carried the scent of dying grass across the Montana territory, whipping Sarah McAllister's threadbare shawl against her trembling shoulders. She stood on the porch of her father's failing homestead, watching two men on horseback approach through the golden haze of late afternoon. Her father's voice drifted from inside the cabin, sharp with desperation, as he counted coins that clinked like broken promises. "Sarah, come inside," her father called, but she remained frozen, her green eyes fixed on the approaching riders. The larger man sat straight in his saddle, his black coat pristine against the dust and decay that surrounded their property. Even from a distance, she could feel the weight of his gaze, cold and calculating as winter frost. Josiah Blackwood dismounted with practiced grace, his silver spurs catching the dying light. Behind him, his foreman stayed mounted, hand resting casually on his gun. Sarah had heard whispers about Blackwood in town, how he'd built his empire on the bones of smaller ranchers, how men who crossed him tended to disappear into the vast emptiness of the territory. "McAllister," Blackwood's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Time to settle accounts, do." Her father emerged from the cabin, shoulders bent beneath invisible weight. In his weathered hands, he clutched a small leather pouch that barely filled his palm. "This is all I have, Josiah. The drought killed most of the cattle, and the bank isn't my concern." Blackwood's dark eyes shifted to Sarah, studying her like a prize horse at auction. "But we discussed alternative arrangements." Sarah's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She stepped backward, her bare feet finding the rough wooden planks of the porch. "Papa, what is he talking about?" Her father wouldn't meet her eyes. His hands shook as he extended the pouch toward Blackwood. $50 silver as promised. She's 19, healthy, can cook and clean. She'll make a good wife." "Papa, no." The words escaped her lips as barely more than a whisper, but they seemed to echo across the empty prairie like a scream. Blackwood took the pouch without taking his eyes off Sarah. "The debt was $250, and the girl makes us even." The world tilted beneath Sarah's feet. She pressed her back against the cabin wall, splinters catching in her worn dress. "I won't go with you. You can't make me." Her father's face crumpled like old parchment. "Sarah, you don't understand. They'll take the land, everything. This is the only way." "There's always a choice, girl," Blackwood said, his voice deceptively gentle. "You come with me willing, and your father keeps his homestead. You fight, and I take everything anyway. At least this way, the old man survives winter." Sarah looked at her father's defeated posture, at the tremor in his hands, at the grey pallor of his skin that spoke of too many sleepless nights and too little food. The cabin behind them sagged on its foundation, chinked with mud that wouldn't last another hard freeze. She thought of her mother's grave, marked by a simple wooden cross behind the house, and wondered what advice the dead might offer the living. "1 hour," she said finally, "to pack my things." Blackwood nodded curtly. "Don't keep me waiting." Inside the dim cabin, Sarah moved mechanically, folding her few possessions into a canvas satchel. Her mother's Bible, worn smooth by countless readings, a silver locket containing a pressed flower from their old home in Ohio, 2 dresses, patched and mended until they were more thread than original fabric. Her hands shook as she wrapped her mother's china teacup in a torn petticoat, the last beautiful thing in a world that had forgotten beauty. Her father sat at the rough-hewn table, head buried in his hands. "I'm sorry, Sarah. God forgive me. I'm so sorry." "Don't apologize for surviving, Papa." She kissed the top of his graying head, breathing in the familiar scent of tobacco and desperation. "Just promise me you'll eat. Promise me you'll take care of yourself." When she emerged from the cabin, Blackwood was waiting with a second horse, a gentle mare with kind eyes. He helped her mount with surprising courtesy, his large hands steady on her waist. She tried not to think about how those same hands had signed papers that traded her like livestock. The ride to Blackwood's ranch passed in silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the whisper of wind through dried grass. Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, watching the sun sink toward distant mountains like a dying coal. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and merciless as a prayer. Blackwood's ranch house rose from the prairie like a monument to ambition, 2 stories of whitewashed wood and glass windows that caught the last rays of sunlight. Outbuildings clustered around it like supplicants, barns, corrals, bunkhouses that spoke of prosperity built on the sweat of others. Smoke drifted from multiple chimneys, carrying the scent of roasted meat that made Sarah's empty stomach clench with hunger. A Mexican woman emerged from the house as they approached, her dark hair streaked with silver, her eyes sharp with intelligence and something that might have been pity. She helped Sarah down from the horse with gentle hands. "I am Esperanza," she said in accented English. "The housekeeper. Come, child, you must be tired." Blackwood dismounted and tossed his reins to a waiting stable boy. "Show her to the blue room, Esperanza. She'll need suitable clothes. We'll discuss the arrangement tomorrow." Sarah followed Esperanza up the wide front steps, her worn boots silent on polished wood. The interior of the house surprised her with its understated elegance. Heavy wooden furniture, oil paintings of pastoral scenes, a grandfather clock whose measured ticking marked time like a heartbeat. Everything spoke of wealth, but wealth tempered by lonely practicality. The blue room was larger than her father's entire cabin, with a 4-poster bed draped in clean linens and a window that looked out over endless grassland. Sarah set her satchel on a chair upholstered in midnight blue velvet and turned to find Esperanza watching her with knowing eyes. "He is not a gentle man," Esperanza said quietly, "but he is not cruel without reason. Be careful, but do not despair. Even the hardest ground can yield flowers if tended properly." Left alone, Sarah sank onto the edge of the bed and allowed herself to cry for the first time since leaving her father's homestead. The tears came silently, years of suppressed grief and fear flowing down her cheeks like rain on parched earth. Outside her window, the first stars appeared in a sky the color of deep water, beautiful and indifferent as eternity. Morning brought the sound of cattle lowing in distant pastures and the rich aroma of coffee drifting up from the kitchen. Sarah dressed in her cleanest dress and braided her auburn hair with shaking fingers. When she descended the stairs, she found Blackwood seated at a massive oak table, reading a newspaper by lamplight. He looked up as she entered, his dark eyes taking in her appearance with the same calculating gaze from the day before. "Sit. Esperanza has prepared breakfast." The older woman appeared as if summoned, setting a plate before Sarah loaded with eggs, bacon, and biscuits still warm from the oven. Sarah's mouth watered despite her circumstances. She hadn't eaten a meal this substantial in months. "Eat," Blackwood commanded, his tone gentle but brooking no argument. "You're too thin." Sarah ate slowly, conscious of his eyes upon her. The food was delicious, each bite a reminder of how close she and her father had come to starvation. When she finished, Blackwood folded his newspaper and leaned back in his chair. "I want to make our situation clear," he said. "You are here to fulfill a debt, nothing more. I expect you to help Esperanza with household duties, to conduct yourself with dignity, and to cause no trouble. In return, you'll be clothed, fed, and housed comfortably. When I decide to marry, we'll discuss the terms of that arrangement. And if I refuse to marry you," his smile held no warmth, "then you'll find yourself with nowhere to go and no means of survival in territory where winter kills the unprepared. I'm offering you security, Sarah. Don't mistake it for charity." The days that followed settled into a rhythm as predictable as the sunrise. Sarah worked alongside Esperanza, learning to cook for the ranch hands, to mend clothes with neat stitches, to manage the constant battle against dust and dirt that prairie living demanded. The work was hard, but satisfying in a way that surprised her. For the first time in years, she went to bed with a full stomach and woke in a warm room. Blackwood remained a distant presence, appearing at meal times or passing through the house on business. He treated her with cold courtesy, never raising his voice or making demands beyond the work expected of any household member. Yet Sarah felt his attention like a weight, always aware of his presence, even when he wasn't in the room. The other ranch hands gave her a wide berth, tipping their hats politely but never lingering to talk. She understood their caution. She belonged to Blackwood as surely as his cattle or his land, and smart men didn't covet their employer's property. 3 weeks into her residency, a letter arrived from town. Esperanza brought it to Sarah as she worked in the garden, pulling the last vegetables before the hard freeze. Sarah's hands trembled as she recognized her father's shaky handwriting. "My dearest Sarah," the letter began, "I hope this finds you well and safe. The doctor says my heart is failing, but don't worry about me. Blackwood has kept his word. I still have the land, and there's enough firewood to last the winter. I think of you every day and pray God will forgive an old man's desperate choices. You are stronger than you know, child. Remember that." Sarah pressed the letter to her chest and wept among the dying tomato plants, great heaving sobs that seemed to tear from her very soul. Esperanza found her there as the sun set, gathering her up like a broken bird and leading her inside to the warmth of the kitchen. "He is dying," Sarah whispered through her tears. Esperanza nodded sadly. "The heart knows when it is time, child. But love does not die with the body. It lives on in those we leave behind." That evening, Blackwood appeared in the kitchen doorway as Sarah helped with dinner preparations. His face was unreadable as he took in her red-rimmed eyes and pale complexion. "I received word from town," he said quietly, "about your father's condition." Sarah's hands stilled on the bread dough she was kneading. "Will you let me go to him? The doctor says it could be days or weeks. You can't camp in his cabin indefinitely." "He's my father." The words came out fiercer than she intended, her grief hardening into determination. "He has no one else." Blackwood studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. Finally he nodded. "I'll have Miguel drive you to town in the morning. You can stay until—" He didn't finish the sentence, but his meaning was clear. The ride to town passed in tense silence, Sarah's anxiety growing with each mile. When they reached her father's homestead, she was shocked by how much smaller it seemed, how fragile against the vast sky. Her father lay in the narrow bed where her mother had died, his skin grey as old paper, his breathing shallow and labored. "Sarah," his voice was barely a whisper, "I'm here, Papa." She took his cold hand in both of hers, feeling how light he'd become, as if he were already halfway to wherever souls go when they leave the flesh behind. They talked in whispers as the day faded, sharing memories of better times when her mother was alive, and the future seemed full of promise. Her father told her stories she'd never heard before, how he'd met her mother at a church social in Ohio, how they dreamed of building an empire on the frontier, how love had sustained them through hardships that would have broken lesser people. "I don't regret coming west," he said, as stars appeared in the darkening sky. "We had good years, your mother and I, real good years. And we had you." He died just before dawn, as quietly as he'd lived, his hand still clasped in Sarah's. She sat with him until full daylight, memorizing his peaceful face before walking to town to make arrangements with the undertaker. If this story has touched your heart so far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with friends who love Old West stories. The funeral was a simple affair, attended by a handful of neighbors who'd known her father as an honest man who'd worked hard and hurt no one. They laid him to rest beside her mother under the vast Montana sky, marked by a wooden cross that would weather and fade like everything else on the unforgiving frontier. Miguel found Sarah sitting beside the graves as sunset painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. He waited respectfully as she said her final goodbye, then helped her into the wagon for the journey back to Blackwood's ranch. The house seemed different when they returned, more welcoming somehow, as if her absence had made her appreciate its solid warmth. Esperanza embraced her like a daughter, clucking over how thin she'd become during her vigil. That night, Sarah slept deeply for the first time in weeks, emotionally drained but strangely at peace. She woke to find Blackwood seated in the chair beside her bed, his presence so unexpected that she gasped and pulled the blankets to her chin. Early morning light filtered through the curtains, casting his features in sharp relief. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said quietly. Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of mockery or calculation, but found only what seemed like genuine sympathy. "Thank you. Your father spoke of you often when he came to town, said you reminded him of your mother, stubborn as a mule and twice as beautiful." Despite her grief, Sarah felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. "He never mentioned knowing you before the debt." Blackwood was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she'd never heard before. "I knew your mother first, before she married your father, before they came west. We were close once upon a time." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She sat up straighter, studying Blackwood's face with new understanding. "You loved her. I thought I did. But I was young and foolish, more interested in building an empire than building a life. She chose your father because he offered her what I couldn't, a gentle heart and the promise of a real home. And you never forgave her for that choice." Blackwood's smile was bitter as winter wind. "I never forgave myself for letting her go. When I heard about the debt, about your father's desperation..." He trailed off, his jaw tightening with some internal struggle. "You saw a chance for revenge." "I saw a chance to possess something that had been hers, her daughter, her family line. It was petty and cruel, and I'm not proud of it." Sarah felt the pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, understanding finally dawning. "That's why you've barely touched me. You can't stand to look at me because I remind you of her." Blackwood stood abruptly, pacing to the window where he stood with his back to her, shoulders rigid with tension. "You're nothing like her. She was gentle, accommodating. You burn like wildfire, beautiful and dangerous." The unexpected compliment left Sarah breathless. In all the weeks she'd lived under his roof, Blackwood had never shown her anything warmer than distant courtesy. Now she glimpsed the man beneath the cold exterior, wounded, lonely, carrying decades of regret like stones in his heart. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now you choose." He turned to face her, his dark eyes intense. "Your father's debt died with him, but you've more than fulfilled any obligation through your work here these past months. You're free to leave, to make your own way in the world. I'll give you money for passage east, letters of recommendation. You can start over somewhere no one knows your history. And if I stay?" "If you stay, it won't be as my captive. It will be because you want to be here, because you choose to make a life with me despite everything that's happened." Sarah pulled her knees to her chest, overwhelmed by the sudden shift in her circumstances. Freedom, the thing she'd dreamed of during countless sleepless nights, was being offered freely. Yet the thought of leaving filled her with unexpected sadness. "I need time to think." Blackwood nodded curtly. "Take all the time you need. Just remember, I'm not a good man, Sarah. I've done things, hurt people, made choices that decent folks would find unforgivable. If you stay, it won't be a fairy tale." After he left, Sarah dressed slowly and made her way downstairs. The house felt different now that she knew she could leave it. Less like a prison and more like a home she'd grown to love, despite herself. She found Esperanza in the kitchen, humming a Mexican lullaby as she kneaded bread. "You heard?" Sarah asked. Esperanza nodded without looking up from her work. "Walls have ears in houses this old. The question is, what does your heart tell you?" My heart is confused. A month ago I hated him for what he did to me, to my family. Now you see the man behind the mask. Esperanza shaped the dough into loaves with practiced hands. He has been alone so long, he has forgotten how to be anything else. But you, child, you remind him of what it feels like to hope. Sarah spent the day walking the grounds of the ranch, thinking about her choices. She watched the cattle grazing in distant pastures, breathed the clean air that carried the scent of grass and endless sky, listened to the sound of wind through the eaves of the barn. This land was harsh and unforgiving, but it was also beautiful in a way that made her chest ache with longing. That evening, she found Blackwood in his study, sitting before a cold fireplace with a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked up when she entered, his face carefully neutral. "I've made my decision," she said. He set down his glass with deliberate care. "I'm listening. I'll stay, but not as your debt payment or your possession. If I'm going to be here, it will be as your equal." Something flickered in his dark eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or relief. "What does that mean?" "It means I want to know about the ranch, about the business. I want to have a say in decisions that affect our lives. And if we're going to marry eventually, I want it to be because we choose each other, not because of some arrangement made in desperation." Blackwood was quiet for a long time, studying her face in the lamplight. Finally, he stood and moved to the fireplace, building a fire with quick, efficient movements. When the flames caught and began to chase away the evening chill, he turned back to her. "I can teach you about ranching. God knows there's enough work for two people who aren't afraid to get their hands dirty. But Sarah, if you stay, if we try to make this work, you need to know the truth about who I am. Tell me." He poured himself another whiskey and settled into his chair, staring into the fire as if seeing ghosts in the flames. "I wasn't born to wealth. My father was a gambler and a drunk who lost everything we had before I was 16. I learned early that the world doesn't owe you anything. If you want something, you have to take it." Sarah settled into the chair across from him, drawn by the pain in his voice despite her wariness. "I started with nothing but a good horse and a willingness to do whatever it took to survive. I worked cattle drives, hired my gun out to whoever would pay, took what I could from men too weak to hold on to it. I built this ranch on broken dreams and foreclosed loans, and I told myself it was just business. And my father, your father, was different. He never borrowed more than he could pay back, never gambled away his family's future. When the drought hit and his cattle died, he came to me hat in hand, desperate but proud. I could have worked with him, extended the loan, found a way to help a decent man through hard times. But you didn't. No. I saw an opportunity to hurt your mother through her family, to take something beautiful and make it mine, whether it wanted to be or not. It was petty and cruel, and it makes me sick to remember the satisfaction I felt when your father agreed to my terms." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but not for the reasons she expected. The pain in Blackwood's voice was real, his remorse genuine. She was seeing him as she'd never imagined, not as the ruthless rancher who'd bought her like cattle, but as a man haunted by his own choices. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because if we're going to try to build something real together, it has to be built on truth, not lies or half-truths. You deserve to know exactly what kind of man you'd be binding your life to." Sarah stood and moved to the window, looking out at the star-scattered darkness. The night was clear and cold, the kind of night that made the frontier feel both beautiful and terrifying. Behind her, she could hear Blackwood moving restlessly, waiting for her judgment. "I'm not going to pretend what you did was right," she said without turning around. "Taking me from my father, trading in human lives, it was wrong, and the fact that you regret it doesn't erase the harm you caused. I know. But I also know that people can change, that the past doesn't have to define the future. My mother used to say that redemption was always possible for those willing to pay its price." She turned to face him, surprised by the vulnerability in his expression. "What price are you willing to pay, Josiah?" "Whatever it takes. I'll deed half the ranch to you." give you legal protection if something happens to me. I'll treat you as an equal partner in all things, not as property or ornament. And Sarah, I'll spend every day proving that you made the right choice in staying." Winter settled over the Montana Territory like a benediction, bringing snow that transformed the harsh landscape into something ethereal and beautiful. Sarah threw herself into learning the business of ranching with the same determination her father had shown in building his homestead. She rode out with the hands to check on cattle, learned to read weather signs in the color of clouds and the behavior of horses, studied the account books until she could track every dollar spent and earned. Blackwood proved to be a patient teacher, sharing knowledge he'd accumulated through years of hard experience. He showed her how to judge the health of livestock, how to negotiate with buyers, how to plan for the lean months when survival depended on careful preparation. Working alongside him, Sarah began to see glimpses of the man he might have been if life had been kinder, intelligent, capable, even gentle when he forgot to guard himself. Their relationship evolved slowly, built on small moments of understanding and shared purpose. When a blizzard trapped them in the house for 3 days, they spent the time talking by the fire, sharing stories of their childhoods and dreams they'd thought lost forever. When spring roundup began, they worked side by side from dawn to dusk, their partnership seamless as a dance. It was during one of those long spring days that Sarah realized she was falling in love with her husband-to-be. Not the desperate, clinging love of a woman, grateful for rescue, but the deep, abiding love of a woman who'd seen a man's worst qualities and chosen to love him anyway. The revelation terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Blackwood seemed to sense the change in her feelings, treating her with a new tenderness that made her heart ache with longing. He brought her wildflowers picked during his morning rides, left books of poetry on her bedside table, found excuses to brush his fingers against hers when they worked together. The careful distance he'd maintained began to crumble, replaced by a growing intimacy that left them both breathless. One evening in early summer, as they sat on the porch watching lightning flicker on the distant horizon, Blackwood took her hand in his. His fingers were calloused from years of hard work, but his touch was infinitely gentle. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." "What is it? Do you think you could ever love me? Not out of gratitude or necessity, but real love?" Sarah looked into his dark eyes and saw the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide, the fear of rejection that made him strong in all things except this. She thought of the man who'd built a fire for her on cold nights, who'd taught her to read the language of cattle and sky, who'd shared his deepest shames without asking for absolution. "I already do," she whispered. The kiss that followed was everything Sarah had dreamed of, and nothing like she'd expected. It was gentle and fierce, tender and desperate, carrying all the unspoken feelings they'd been building toward for months. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless, staring at each other in wonder. "Marry me," Blackwood said against her lips. "Not because of debt or arrangement, but because I love you and can't imagine my life without you." "Yes," she breathed, sealing the promise with another kiss that tasted like redemption and new beginnings. They were married 2 months later in a simple ceremony conducted by the circuit preacher in town. Sarah wore a new dress of deep blue wool that Esperanza had helped her sew, and carried wildflowers that bloomed late in the mountain meadows. The guest list was small: ranch hands who'd become friends, neighbors who'd learned to respect Sarah's strength and dignity, townsfolk who'd watched their unlikely courtship with growing approval. As they exchanged vows under the endless Montana sky, Sarah thought of her parents buried in the prairie earth near their old homestead, and she could almost feel their blessing on the wind. Josiah's voice was steady as he promised to love and honor her, but she could see the emotion in his eyes, the wonder of a man who'd never expected to find grace. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and lanterns strung between the trees. There was music and dancing, laughter that echoed across the grassland like joy made audible. As the evening wore on and the guests began to drift away, Sarah and Josiah found themselves alone on the porch where so much of their courtship had unfolded. "No regrets?" he asked, pulling her close against his chest. "Only that it took us so long to get here," she replied, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. They spent their wedding night in the blue room where Sarah had first slept, as Blackwood's unwilling guest. Now she came to his arms freely, offering herself not as payment for debt, but as a gift of love freely given. Their joining was tender and passionate, sealing a bond that had been forged through hardship and tempered by choice. In the months that followed, Sarah threw herself into her new role as partner and wife with characteristic determination. She expanded the kitchen garden, started a small flock of chickens, began corresponding with other ranch wives to share knowledge and companionship across the vast distances of the territory. Her suggestions improved ranch operations, and her presence brought a warmth to the house that it had never known. Blackwood flourished under her influence, his harsh edges softening without losing the strength that had built his empire. He smiled more often, laughed at her teasing, showed a gentleness that surprised everyone who'd known him as a ruthless businessman. The other ranchers began to seek his counsel, not just because they feared him, but because they respected the wisdom that came with genuine happiness. 1 year after their wedding, Sarah discovered she was with child. The news filled them both with a joy so profound it seemed to illuminate the world around them. Blackwood became almost comically protective, hovering over her as if she were made of spun glass, while Sarah continued her work with stubborn independence until her expanding belly made riding impossible. Their daughter was born on a crisp October morning, emerging into the world with a lusty cry that echoed across the prairie like a promise. They named her Grace for the unexpected blessing she represented, and she proved to be a perfect blend of her parents, strong-willed like her mother, intelligent like her father, beautiful in the way that prairie wildflowers are beautiful. As Sarah held her daughter for the first time, she thought about the twisting path that had brought her to this moment. She'd been sold for silver to a ruthless rancher, traded like cattle to settle her father's debts. But that transaction, begun in desperation and maintained through duty, had somehow transformed into the greatest love story of her life. She looked up to find Josiah watching them both with an expression of such tender wonder that it took her breath away. This was the man who'd bought her freedom and given her a choice, who'd shared his darkest secrets and asked for nothing but the chance to earn her love. In his eyes, she saw their future stretching ahead, years of partnership and passion, children who would grow up knowing they were wanted, a love that would endure whatever hardships the frontier might bring. "Thank you," he whispered, kissing her forehead as baby Grace slept peacefully between them. "For what?" "For choosing to stay, for seeing something worth saving in a man who thought he was beyond redemption, for giving me a reason to be better than I was." Sarah smiled, exhausted but radiant with contentment. "Thank you for letting me choose, for proving that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the worst circumstances." Outside their window, the Montana wind sang through the eaves of the house, carrying the scent of grass and endless possibility. The frontier stretched away in all directions, harsh and unforgiving as always, but no longer lonely. They had found each other across the vastness of regret and circumstance, two souls who'd learned that love was not about possession but about choice, not about taking but about giving freely. And in the end, that made all the difference. As the seasons turned and Grace grew from infant to toddler to bright-eyed child, the Blackwood Ranch became known throughout the territory, not just for its prosperity, but for its generosity. Sarah insisted on helping struggling neighbors, remembering her own family's desperation, while Josiah found satisfaction in using his wealth to build rather than destroy. They established a school for ranch children, funded a doctor to serve the scattered homesteads, opened their doors to travelers caught by storms or misfortune. The story of how they'd met became legend in the territory. The ruthless rancher who'd bought a bride and found love instead. The desperate daughter who'd transformed captivity into partnership. But those who told the tale missed the deeper truth, that redemption was always possible for those brave enough to reach for it, and that the greatest love stories were not about perfection, but about the choice to see beyond flaws, to the light that lived in every human heart. Sarah McAllister had been sold for silver to a ruthless rancher, but she had bought something far more precious in return, a love that would endure beyond the brief span of mortal years, a legacy that would live on in the children they raised and the lives they touched. In the end, it was not a tragic story at all, but a testament to the power of grace to transform even the darkest circumstances into something beautiful and eternal. Our stories on this channel are fictional, created to inspire and entertain, and are not meant to offend anyone. If you enjoyed this tale of love and redemption on the American frontier, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, comment with your thoughts, and share it with others who love stories of the Old West. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, may your own story be filled with the kind of love that transforms everything